It's good to have a ponytail. Means you have a lot of hair.
I've never seen so many ponytails in my life as the last couple of years, really.
You have a lot of hair.
Mm-mm. Mm-hmm. No, I haven't.
Well, what was your earliest childhood memory?
It's hard to think, is that a real memory or have I seen a picture of that? But I think really, probably when I was 4 years old, I just turned 4, I got sick one night, and
that's a sad first memory.
Well, I was very, very sick, throwing up and all that, and in great pain, and nobody could figure out. My mother was, walking the floor with me. I was crying and all this. My dad didn't know what to do. My aunt came over, who was close to my mom and dad. She couldn't figure it out either. So finally, they took me to the emergency room at the hospital. And they said that my appendix, they did some tests, and they said that my appendix was about to burst. And I remember being at the hospital, and they said they had to do an emergency operation at 4 years of age and took my appendix out. Later, that night, my mother was never able to get our family doctor. He was out of town. But later, she took me to him after I'd gone through all this, and there was a little red dot right here. And he said that a poisonous spider had bitten me there. Oh, this was very dramatic back in those days. And there was so much poison, so much toxin in my system that's why they thought my appendix was about to burst. And that it probably had saved my life, possibly, by going ahead and arresting it when they took the appendix out. And I remember my mother, I was on a stretcher, and I remember rushing down the hallway to the operating room, I guess, and I had on boots, rubber boots. It came way up on my little legs. And I understand they still put something on your feet sometimes because your feet get so cold. And that's what the boots were for. But my mother was walking along holding my hand on this little journey, and she was crying. And I remember telling her, "Don't cry, Mother. I'll be back in just a little while." And I've heard her talk about that, when I was little. But I remember everything about that trip to the hospital. And then later, they brought me, this I remember really well. They brought me home, and I had impetigo, which is little boils. I don't know why, but anyway, it's like an infection. And they itch and sting and hurt. And this same aunt said, "Well, the best thing to do is just sponge her with alcohol."
It's going to burn.
Oh, they said that I went straight up. I was in the bed, and she started swabbing me all over with alcohol. And I really went crazy then, yelling. And I remember that. I remember thinking, what is she doing to me? That's that.
That was your first memory? Was that in the middle of the night when that happened, or was it?
Oh, it was when they took me to the hospital, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother had just given birth to my little sister, who's 4 years younger. And she was nursing my little sister. So she didn't even have a car. And she would have to take a cab to the hospital to see me every day, and then rush home to nurse my sister. I remember her talking about that. And that's a crazy memory, I know, but I think that's the one I remember the most from that young.
When you started growing up, what did you like to do after school and stuff?
Well, when my family was not wealthy or anything close. My dad worked every day. My mother stayed home. There were 4 children. And we did the things that all the other kids did. When I was not a teenager yet, under that, we did things like in the evenings, we would have dinner when Daddy came home from work. My sister and I would have to do the dishes. And then afterwards, we didn't have air conditioning even. I didn't have that until after I married, actually. But my parents would sit out. We had a little front porch, and we had what they used to call a glider. It was like a swing, only it didn't swing like this. They would sit out in the glider on the porch just to spend time together and would watch us. And we'd all be out in the front yard, and we played all kinds of things. The neighborhood kids usually were at my house a lot. And there'd be a bunch of us, and we'd play Red Rover, or we would play plain old hide and seek. And I was the only girl in the bunch who would climb up on top of the house to hide. Because
You're brave.
I was a climber. My husband used to say she spent half her life hanging by her legs from a tree limb. And I sort of did. But we'd play all those kinds of games. But then, and we all, after about 4 years old, we all roller skated. And where we lived, there was a hill behind our house, a really steep hill. And that's what you waited for, was when you were old enough to skate down Dudley Avenue. And the neighbors even used to block off Dudley for us after school sometimes.